Ruby will never figure out the passwords. She's always been terrible with technology. Those were the words I heard through our home office door when I returned early from my business trip. My husband Malcolm's voice, followed by Bridget's familiar laugh, our family friend who'd been his secretary for 3 years. When I discovered they'd drained our $340,000 joint account for their secret Caribbean getaway, they thought I was just a grieving widow's daughter with no head for business. They forgot one crucial detail. My late father had left me control of a $50 million family trust, and I was about to teach them both what real money could do. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in October. I was supposed to be in Chicago until Thursday, finalizing the acquisition of 2 boutique hotels for our family's hospitality business. But when the seller's attorney had a family emergency, our meeting was postponed, and I caught the first flight back to Boston. I'd been looking forward to surprising Malcolm. We'd been married for 8 years, and lately he'd seemed distant, stressed about his struggling marketing consultancy. I thought maybe some unexpected time together would help reconnect us. I even stopped at his favorite bakery on Newberry Street, picking up those expensive French pastries he loved. Our Victorian townhouse in Back Bay was unusually quiet when I unlocked the front door at 2:30 p.m. Malcolm's Tesla was in the driveway, along with a silver BMW I didn't recognize but seemed familiar. I called out, but no one answered. Setting down my luggage and the bakery box, I heard muffled voices coming from the second floor, from Malcolm's home office. "The transfer went through this morning," I heard him saying as I climbed the stairs. $340,000, just like we planned. My heart stopped. Our joint account, the one we'd built together over 8 years of marriage, containing my inheritance from selling my grandmother's house, our wedding gift money, and savings from both our careers. "Are you sure she won't notice?" The second voice was unmistakably Bridget's, Bridget Chen, who'd been Malcolm's secretary since before we were married, who'd been at our wedding, who'd held my hand at my father's funeral just 6 months ago. "She's been so distracted since her father died," Malcolm replied, and I could hear the cruel satisfaction in his voice. "All those trust fund meetings, the lawyers, the estate planning. She barely looks at our regular accounts anymore." I pressed myself against the hallway wall, my mind reeling. They were talking about stealing from me. But why? And how much? "The resort in Barbados confirmed our reservation," Bridget continued. "Presidential suite for 2 weeks. I can't believe we're actually doing this." "We deserve it," Malcolm said. "After everything I've put up with, her father's constant disapproval, always talking about how I wasn't good enough for his precious daughter. Now that he's gone, it's time I got what's mine." My father who'd worked 16-hour days, building his real estate empire from nothing, who'd started with a single apartment building in South Boston and turned it into a portfolio worth hundreds of millions, who died of a heart attack at his desk, still working at 73 because he couldn't bear to slow down. "What if she finds out while we're gone?" Bridget asked, and I detected nervousness in her voice. "Ruby will never figure out the passwords. She's always been terrible with technology. And even if she does, what's she gonna do? Divorce me? She loves me too much. She'll forgive me like she always does." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. Like she always does. How many times had Malcolm betrayed me? Before? How many times had I overlooked warning signs, made excuses, chosen trust over suspicion? "Besides," Malcolm continued, "she's got that massive trust fund now. $50 million. What's $300,000 to someone like that? $50 million. My father's legacy, carefully structured to provide for future generations of our family. Money that came with responsibilities, with expectations, with the weight of my father's life's work. Malcolm saw it as my personal piggy bank. He'd never understood what that trust meant to me, to our family name, to the charitable foundations my father had established. "I still can't believe she chose you over Bradley," Bridget said, and I heard something shift in her tone, something sharper, more vindictive. Everyone knew Bradley Morrison was the better choice. Harvard MBA, family, money, actually understood her world. But she had to rebel, marry the struggling entrepreneur instead. Bradley Morrison, my college boyfriend who'd proposed senior year, who'd had my father's immediate approval, who'd fit perfectly into the life everyone expected me to live. I'd chosen Malcolm instead because I thought I loved him for who he was, not what he represented. Now I wondered if my father's reservations had been right all along. Don't worry about Bradley, Malcolm laughed. He's doing just fine with his hedge fund in Manhattan. Probably doesn't even remember Ruby exists. But I remembered Bradley. I remembered his kindness, his integrity, the way he'd respected my father's opinion even when we disagreed. Most importantly, I remembered that he was now the lead trustee for several major family trusts in New England, including expertise in financial fraud and asset protection. When do we leave? Bridget asked. Friday morning. First class to Bridgetown. Ruby thinks I'm going to that marketing conference in Atlanta. Atlanta. The conference I'd helped him register for, that I'd arranged time off work to support. Another lie in what was apparently an elaborate web of deception. 2 weeks in paradise. Bridget sighed. No phones, no responsibilities, no Ruby. Just us and our new life together, Malcolm agreed. After 8 years of pretending to be the perfect husband, I'm ready to start being honest about what I really want. 8 years. Our entire marriage. Had any of it been real? I backed away from the door slowly, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to burst in, to confront them, to scream about the betrayal and demand answers. But something else was taking hold. Something colder, more calculating. Something that reminded me of my father's business instincts. They thought I was naive, technically incompetent, emotionally dependent. A grieving daughter overwhelmed by suddenly inheriting massive wealth. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I tiptoed downstairs, my heart pounding but my mind clearing with each step. In my purse was my phone, and in my phone were the contacts that could help me understand exactly what Malcolm and Bridget had done, and more importantly, what I could do about it. My father hadn't just left me $50 million. He'd left me the tools, the connections, and the legal framework to protect our family's legacy from exactly this kind of betrayal. Malcolm was right about one thing. I had been terrible with technology, but grief had motivated me to learn, and the trust's financial advisors had insisted I understand every digital system that protected our assets. As I sat in my car in our driveway, I opened my banking app and confirmed my worst fears. Our joint account showed a balance of $847.23, $340,000, gone as of this morning. But Malcolm had made one crucial miscalculation. The grieving, naive wife he thought he'd married had died with my father 6 months ago. The woman sitting in this car was my father's daughter, and she was about to show him what $50 million in professional revenge actually looked like. The weight of my father's death had been suffocating me for 6 months. Henry Blackwood had been more than my father. He'd been my mentor, my anchor, the one person who understood the burden that came with generational wealth. When his heart attack took him at his desk on a rainy April morning, I hadn't just lost a parent. I'd lost my guide to a world I'd never wanted to navigate alone. The weeks following his funeral had been a maze of lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors. Suddenly, I was responsible for a $50 million trust that supported 12 different charitable foundations, employed over 300 people across various businesses, and carried the weight of my father's 40-year legacy. Everyone spoke to me in careful, measured tones, treating me like fragile crystal that might shatter under the pressure. Malcolm had been my emotional refuge during those overwhelming months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. While lawyers explained complex estate structures and accountants detailed tax implications, he'd been the one to hold me while I cried, to make sure I ate dinner, to remind me that I was still Ruby, not just Henry Blackwood's heir. I'd leaned on him completely, trusting him to handle the smaller details of our life together while I tried to figure out how to fill my father's enormous shoes. "Don't worry about the household accounts," he'd told me repeatedly. "I'll handle the day-to-day stuff. You focus on the big picture." I'd been grateful. Managing a trust fund was terrifying enough without worrying about mortgage payments and utility bills. Malcolm had always handled our joint finances anyway. He was the entrepreneur, the one comfortable with numbers and negotiations. I'd focused on my event planning business, small and manageable compared to my father's empire. What I hadn't realized was how vulnerable my grief had made me. How easy it had been for Malcolm to exploit my emotional exhaustion, to position himself as my protector while systematically betraying me. The signs had been there. I saw that now, sitting in my car, my hands shaking as I scrolled through months of banking transactions on my phone. The expensive dinners charged to our joint account, dinners that happened on nights when Malcolm claimed to be working late. The mysterious weekend client meetings that required him to be out of town. The new clothes, the upgraded phone, the sudden interest in high-end restaurants I'd never heard of. "Business is picking up," he'd explained when I'd noticed his improved wardrobe. "I need to look successful to attract better clients." I'd been proud of him, my husband the entrepreneur, finally getting the recognition he deserved. I'd even bragged to my friends about Malcolm's growing success, never questioning why none of this new business was reflected in his company's actual revenue. Bridget's betrayal cut even deeper. She'd been part of our lives for years, joining Malcolm's struggling consultancy when she'd graduated from Suffolk University with her business degree. She'd been at our wedding, dancing with my cousin Glenn at the reception. She'd sent flowers when my father died, had held my hand at the wake, had whispered comforting words about how proud he would have been of the woman I'd become. "Malcolm's so lucky to have you," she'd told me at the funeral. "You're handling everything with such grace." Grace? I'd thought I was being graceful, leaning on my husband and trusting our family friend. In reality, I'd been making myself the perfect victim. The most painful part was realizing how isolated I'd become. My father's death had consumed so much energy that I'd let other relationships drift. My college friends lived scattered across the country, busy with their own careers and families. My mother had died when I was 12, and my father had never remarried, pouring all his emotional energy into building his business empire and raising me. The business world my father had inhabited was filled with people who knew my name, who treated me with professional respect, but who didn't really know me. They saw Henry Blackwood's daughter, the heir to his fortune, not Ruby the person. In the months since his death, I'd attended dozens of meetings where men in expensive suits spoke to me like I was playing dress-up in my father's world. "Your father was a visionary," they'd say. "We're here to help you preserve his legacy." But none of them had asked what I wanted. None of them had bothered to learn that I'd graduated magna cum laude from Boston College with degrees in both business and psychology. That I'd built my event planning company from nothing, growing it to 6 employees and $500,000 in annual revenue. That I'd been my father's unofficial advisor on employee relations and customer service for years, attending his board meetings and offering insights he'd genuinely valued. They saw a grieving daughter overwhelmed by sudden wealth. Malcolm saw a convenient source of funding for his midlife crisis. Bridget saw an obstacle to her romantic ambitions. None of them saw the woman my father had actually raised, someone who'd learned business strategy at the dinner table, who'd spent summers working in his properties to understand every aspect of the operation, who'd inherited not just his money but his instincts for reading people and situations. My father had taught me that the most dangerous opponent was the one who underestimated you. "Let them think you're weak," he'd once told me after a particularly difficult negotiation with a contractor who'd tried to overcharge us. Let them reveal their true intentions, then use their assumptions against them. Sitting in my driveway, looking up at the house I'd shared with Malcolm for 5 years, I realized I was in the perfect position to follow my father's advice. Everyone thought I was broken, dependent, technically incompetent. Malcolm and Bridget were so confident in their deception that they were planning a 2-week vacation with my money, believing I'd never notice or never have the strength to fight back. They were about to discover that grief hadn't made me weak. It had made me angry. And anger, combined with $50 million and my father's business network, was about to become their worst nightmare. I looked at my phone again, at the contact list that included some of the most powerful financial minds in New England. My father's colleagues, his attorneys, his investigators. People who'd respected him and who, by extension, were prepared to help his daughter. Malcolm thought he was stealing from a naive widow's child. He was actually stealing from Henry Blackwood's heir, and Henry Blackwood had never lost a fight that mattered. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, letting the full reality settle in. My husband and our family friend had stolen nearly everything from our joint account and were planning to disappear to Barbados for 2 weeks, funded by my money. But the more I thought about it, the more questions emerged. $340,000 was a substantial sum, but for a 2-week vacation, even the most luxurious resort wouldn't cost that much. This wasn't just about a vacation. This was about something bigger. I needed information, and I needed it without alerting them that I was home early. Quietly, I drove to the Starbucks 3 blocks away, ordered a coffee I didn't want, and settled into a corner table with my laptop. The first call I made was to Deborah Sterling, my father's estate attorney, and someone who'd known me since I was 15. Deborah had been my father's trusted advisor for over 20 years, and she'd guided me through the complex process of inheriting the trust. "Ruby?" Deborah's voice was warm but concerned. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you today. How are you holding up?" "I need your help with something urgent," I said, keeping my voice low. "It's about Malcolm." There was a pause. "What's happened?" I explained what I'd overheard, the missing money, their planned trip. Deborah listened without interruption, but I could hear her taking notes. "Ruby, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Has Malcolm ever asked you about the trust, about how to access it, or whether you could make distributions to him directly?" My blood ran cold. "Yes, about a month ago, he asked if I could lend him money to expand his business. He said it would just be temporary, that he'd pay it back, with interest." "What did you tell him?" "That the trust doesn't work that way, that it's not my personal account. It's a fiduciary responsibility with specific purposes and oversight requirements." I paused, remembering Malcolm's reaction. He seemed frustrated. He said something about how my father had tied up the money unnecessarily. "Ruby, I think we need to look at this more carefully. Can you access your personal banking from where you are?" I logged into our joint checking account and walked Deborah through the transaction history over the past 6 months. What I found made my stomach drop. The withdrawals had been happening gradually since July, 2 months after my father's death. Small amounts at first, $2,000 here, $5,000 there. Amounts that wouldn't trigger automatic alerts, that could be explained as legitimate expenses, but they'd been steadily increasing in size and frequency. "He's been testing you," Deborah said grimly, "seeing how much he could take before you noticed." "But why now? Why such a large amount all at once?" "Because something's changed. Ruby, I need you to check something else. Can you access Malcolm's business accounts? As his wife, you should have been added as an authorized user for tax purposes." I had forgotten about that. When Malcolm had incorporated his consultancy, his accountant had recommended adding me to the business accounts to simplify our joint tax filings. I'd signed the paperwork years ago but never paid attention to the actual accounts. It took me several tries to remember the login information, but eventually, I accessed Malcolm's business banking. What I found there made the joint account situation look minor. His business was failing, catastrophically. The account showed months of overdraft fees, bounce checks, and a current balance of negative $12,000. But more disturbing were the regular deposits that clearly didn't come from legitimate business income. Deposits that matched almost exactly with the withdrawals from our joint account. Deborah, he's been using our money to prop up his failing business for months. How much total? I did quick calculations, cross-referencing dates and amounts. At least $60,000 before this week's big withdrawal. Ruby, this isn't just marital infidelity or even simple theft. This is systematic financial fraud. And if he's planning to disappear for 2 weeks with Bridget, there's a good chance he's not planning to come back. The possibility hadn't occurred. To me, but it made horrible sense. Malcolm had been distant for months, not just emotionally but practically. He'd been organizing his affairs, liquidating what he could access, and positioning himself for an exit strategy. What should I do? First, don't confront him yet. If he's planning to run, we don't want to spook him into accelerating his timeline. Second, I'm going to make some calls. Your father had relationships with some very capable people, financial investigators, asset recovery specialists. We need to understand the full scope of what he's done before we decide how to respond. Can we freeze the accounts? The joint account, yes, but it might alert him that you're onto him. Let me talk to a few people first. I want to understand his complete financial picture before we make any moves. After I hung up with Deborah, I sat staring at my laptop screen, trying to process everything I'd learned. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. Malcolm had been systematically stealing from me for months, using our shared life as cover for increasingly bold financial fraud. But something else was bothering me. Something about Bridget's involvement. That didn't quite make sense. I opened a new browser window and searched for her social media profiles, something I'd never done before because I'd trusted her as a friend. What I found there made my hands shake. Her Instagram showed a lifestyle that her secretary's salary couldn't possibly support. Designer handbags, expensive dinners, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and in several recent photos, I could see a man's shadow or reflection, someone she was clearly with, but being careful not to show directly. But it was the timestamps that really got my attention. Photos from restaurants posted on nights when Malcolm had claimed to be working late. Travel photos from weekends when he'd told me he was visiting his mother in Hartford. They'd been together for months, maybe longer. This wasn't a sudden affair, it was a long-term relationship that had been carefully hidden from me. I scrolled back through her posts from the past year, looking for clues I'd missed. There, in a photo from last Christmas, a picture of an expensive bracelet with the caption, "Early Christmas surprise from someone special." I remembered that bracelet. I'd complimented Bridget on it at our New Year's party, and she'd blushed and said it was a gift from her mystery man. Malcolm had given her jewelry for Christmas. Expensive jewelry, judging from the brand visible in the photo. While I'd been struggling with my father's recent diagnosis, while our family had been focused on his declining health, Malcolm had been buying gifts for his secretary with money from our joint account. My phone buzzed with a text from Malcolm. "Missing you. How's Chicago? Can't wait to hear about the hotel deal." I stared at the message, struck by how easy it was for him to lie, even in something as simple as a text. He was probably with Bridget right now, maybe planning their trip, maybe celebrating their successful theft. I typed back, "Meeting's going well. Might be delayed until Friday. We'll call tonight." If they were planning to leave Friday morning, I now had 4 days to understand exactly what they'd done and figure out how to stop them. 4 days to transform from victim to strategist. But I wouldn't be doing it alone. My father had spent decades building a network of the smartest, most resourceful people in New England. It was time to find out if Henry Blackwood's daughter could mobilize that network for her own purposes. 20 minutes after my call with Deborah, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a crisp, professional voice introduced herself as Elaine Rodriguez, financial investigator with Sterling and Associates, apparently one of the firms my father had used for sensitive matters. "Mrs. Blackwood Henderson," she said, using my married name with a slight emphasis that suggested she had opinions about it. "Deborah Sterling asked me to reach out to you immediately. She's explained the basic situation, but I need to ask you some specific questions to understand what we're dealing with." I found myself gravitating toward her direct, no-nonsense approach. After months of people treating me like fragile glass, it was refreshing to speak with someone who seemed to see me as a capable adult facing a serious problem. First question. Do you have any reason to believe Malcolm has access to information about your trust fund? Bank statements, legal documents, anything that would give him detailed knowledge of your assets? The question hit me like ice water. He sees mail that comes to the house, legal documents, bank statements. I never thought to hide them. What about passwords, computer access? My stomach dropped. We share a home computer, and I paused, embarrassed. I'm terrible at remembering passwords. I write them down in a notebook that I keep in my desk at home. There was a long silence. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to assume that Malcolm has complete knowledge of your financial situation, your trust, your personal accounts, your business assets, all of it." The implications crashed over me. If Malcolm knew about the trust's structure, its value, its limitations, then his theft of our joint account wasn't desperation or opportunism. It was the opening move in a much larger scheme. What would he be able to do with that information? That depends. Does Malcolm have any legal authority over your affairs? Power of attorney? Business partnerships? Anything that would give him signing authority? I thought carefully. No direct authority over the trust. That has multiple trustees and strict oversight. But my heart sank as I remembered. We have some smaller joint investments, a vacation rental property we bought in Vermont, some stock portfolios managed by his financial advisor. How much total value? Maybe $200,000 in the rental property, another $150,000 in the investment accounts. And who manages those accounts day to day? Malcolm does. I signed the paperwork, but he handles all the communications with the investment firm. Elaine's silence spoke volumes. Finally, she said, "I'm going to need you to check those accounts immediately. All of them. And Mrs. Henderson? Don't do it from your home computer or your usual devices. Can you access everything from where you are now?" My hands were shaking as I logged into our investment accounts from my laptop. The Vermont property account showed a recent sale, completed just 3 weeks ago. The proceeds, $187,000, had been transferred to an account I didn't recognize. "The rental property," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He sold it 3 weeks ago." "Without your knowledge?" I thought he was just talking to realtors about getting it appraised for insurance purposes. He said the market was good, that we should know its current value. The investment portfolios were worse. Account after account showed liquidation transactions, dating back 2 months. Everything had been sold and transferred to external accounts that weren't in my name. "Elaine, it's all gone. Everything except the trust. He's liquidated nearly $400,000 in assets over the past 2 months, and you never received any confirmation calls or emails about these transactions?" I thought back through recent months, trying to remember. There were some calls, but Malcolm always answered them. He said they were routine check-ins from our advisor. "Mrs. Henderson, I think we need to consider the possibility that this isn't just theft. This looks like someone methodically liquidating assets in preparation for permanent disappearance." The word hit me like a physical blow. Disappearance. Not just the affair, not just financial infidelity, but complete abandonment. 8 years of marriage, everything we'd built together, discarded so he could start over with Bridget and my money. There's something else, Elaine continued. Deborah mentioned that Malcolm recently asked about accessing your trust directly. Can you tell me exactly what he said? I recounted the conversation from a month ago, Malcolm's frustration when I'd explained the trust's restrictions, his comment about my father tying up the money unnecessarily. Did he ask about specific procedures? How decisions are made? Who has authority? Anything like that? Yes, actually. He wanted to know if there were emergency provisions, situations where funds could be released quickly without the normal oversight process. And what did you tell him? That there are provisions for family emergencies, medical crises, legal emergencies, things like that. But they require documentation and approval from at least 2 trustees. Another long pause. Mrs. Henderson, I think Malcolm has been planning this for months, possibly since your father's death. The timing isn't coincidental. He waited until you inherited significant wealth, then began systematically accessing everything he could reach legally while positioning himself to access more. But the trust has safeguards. He can't just steal $50 million. No, but he might not need to. If he's successfully stolen $400,000 to $500,000 from your joint assets, plus whatever business funds he's diverted, he could disappear with close to $1 million total. Enough to live very comfortably in a country without extradition treaties. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. This wasn't an affair that had gotten out of hand. This was a calculated, long-term plan to systematically rob me and disappear. Malcolm had been playing a different game entirely, one where our marriage was just cover for the biggest theft of his life. What do we do now? First, we document everything. I'm sending you a secure link where you can upload screenshots of all these accounts, all transaction histories, everything. Second, we need to understand his exit strategy. If he's planning to disappear Friday, he's got logistics in place. New identities, international accounts, somewhere to go where he thinks he can't be found. Can we stop him? Mrs. Henderson, your father didn't just leave you $50 million. He left you connections to some of the most sophisticated financial recovery and investigation capabilities in the country. Malcolm made one crucial mistake. What's that? He stole from Henry Blackwood's daughter. Your father spent 40 years building relationships with people who don't forget favors owed, and every single one of them is about to learn that someone tried to rob his little girl. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt something other than shock and betrayal. I felt the stirring of my father's business instincts, the strategic mind he'd spent years developing in me. Elaine, what do you need from me? Everything you can. Remember about Malcolm's plans, his habits, his connections? And Mrs. Henderson, don't go home tonight. If he's planning to disappear and if he suspects you might know something, you could be in danger. Danger. The word sent a chill through me. Malcolm wasn't just a cheating husband anymore. He was a man who'd stolen nearly $1 million and was planning to vanish forever. People who made plans like that didn't leave loose ends behind. Following Elaine's advice, I checked into the Four Seasons downtown under my maiden name, Blackwood. As I sat in the elegant hotel room that night, methodically uploading financial documents to Elaine's secure server, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. Malcolm's theft hadn't started with my father's death. It had started the day my father was diagnosed with heart disease 8 months ago. The timeline was damning. My father's first heart attack had been in February. The doctors had been optimistic. Then, talking about lifestyle changes and medication management. But Malcolm must have seen something I hadn't. The possibility that Henry Blackwood might not survive another episode. The earliest suspicious transactions in our accounts dated back to February 15th, just 3 days after my father's cardiac event. Small transfers, carefully timed to coincide with my emotional distraction. While I'd been focused on my father's health, driving him to medical appointments and helping him adjust his business schedule, Malcolm had been calculating how to position himself for the eventual inheritance. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized this conspiracy went beyond Malcolm and Bridget. The investment accounts that had been liquidated, those transactions had required sophisticated financial knowledge and connections that Malcolm simply didn't possess. His marketing consultancy was failing specifically because he wasn't good with numbers or complex financial structures. I called Elaine back. I think Malcolm had help. Professional help. What makes you say that? The investment liquidations were too clean, too expertly timed to avoid tax penalties and regulatory flags. Malcolm barely balances his own checkbook. Someone with serious financial expertise guided these transactions. Any idea who? I'd been thinking about that. His cousin, Joseph Hartwell. He works for a private wealth management firm in Hartford, Meridian Capital. He's the one who set up our investment portfolios in the first place. That's interesting. Meridian Capital manages assets for several high-net-worth families in Connecticut. If Joseph was involved, this theft could be much more sophisticated than we initially thought. The implications made my blood run cold. Joseph had been at our wedding, had been to our house for family dinners, had met my father multiple times. He'd seemed like a genuinely nice person, quiet, professional, someone who genuinely cared about helping families build long-term wealth. But more troubling, Joseph had access to information about our complete financial picture. When he'd set up our investment accounts, I'd provided him with detailed information about my expected inheritance, my father's business structure, even preliminary estate planning documents. At the time, it had seemed responsible. Comprehensive financial planning required understanding all assets. Now I realized I'd given a potential criminal complete intelligence about my family's wealth. Elaine. Joseph knows everything. The trust, structure, the estate timeline, even which assets would be most liquid after my father's death. We need to examine his involvement immediately. Can you think of any unusual interactions with Joseph over the past year? I thought back through family gatherings and business discussions. Actually, yes. At Christmas dinner, Joseph asked very specific questions about my father's health, about succession planning for the business. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation, maybe looking for professional insights he could use with other clients. What kind of questions? Whether my father had updated his will recently, what would happen to the business if something happened to him, whether I was prepared to take over the financial management. I remember thinking it was odd timing. My father was right there at the dinner table. He was gathering intelligence. The conversation was interrupted by a text from Malcolm. Hey babe, tried calling, but it went to voicemail. Hope the meetings are going well. Bridget says hi. She's here helping me prep for the Atlanta conference. The casual reference to Bridget's presence made my stomach turn. They weren't even being careful anymore. They were so confident in their deception that they were spending the evening together at my house, probably celebrating their upcoming escape. But something about the message bothered me. Malcolm never called me babe. In 8 years of marriage, he'd always used my name or honey. The informal tone felt wrong, almost like someone else had written it. Elaine, I think they're testing me. This text from Malcolm, it doesn't sound like him. Forward it to me. What else feels off? The reference to Bridget. He's never mentioned her being at the house in the evening before. It's like he wants me to know they're together. That suggests they're confident you won't be back before they leave. Ruby, I need to ask you something important. Did you tell anyone the specific details of your travel schedule? Anyone who might have passed that information to Malcolm? My heart sank. My assistant, Claire. She coordinates my calendar with Malcolm's schedule so we can plan family time around business trips. She would have told him about the meeting postponement, about my early return. When did she last communicate with Malcolm about your schedule? I checked my phone for Claire's recent messages. She sent him my updated itinerary this morning, including my original return date of Thursday. But she wouldn't have known about the meeting cancellation. That happened after business hours. So, Malcolm thinks you're not coming back until Thursday, which gives them 3 full days to finalize their plans and disappear. Ruby, I think we need to consider that they might accelerate their timeline if they suspect anything. The thought terrified me. If Malcolm and Bridget realized I was onto them, they might not wait until Friday. They had already stolen nearly $1 million, enough to disappear immediately if they felt threatened. What should I do about the text? Respond normally, but don't give them any reason to think you're suspicious. And Ruby, I've been making some calls about Joseph Hartwell. We need to talk in person tomorrow morning. Can you meet me at 8 a.m.? What did you find? Joseph left Meridian Capital 6 weeks ago. Officially, he's taking a sabbatical to pursue other opportunities. Unofficially, there were questions about some client account irregularities. Nothing was ever proven, but he was asked to resign. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Joseph hadn't just helped Malcolm steal from me, he'd been stealing from other clients as well. My father's death and my inheritance had probably been the biggest score in a pattern of financial crimes that had cost him his career. How much do you think they've stolen total? If Joseph was systematically defrauding clients and Malcolm was his inside source for information about high net worth targets, we could be looking at several $1 million across multiple victims. I felt sick. This wasn't just about my marriage, or even my money anymore. Malcolm and his cousin had been running a sophisticated financial fraud operation, and I'd been their primary target because of my father's wealth and my perceived vulnerability. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that grief and inexperience made me helpless. They'd never considered that Henry Blackwood might have raised a daughter capable of fighting back with every resource at her disposal. I typed back to Malcolm. Thanks for the update. Long day of meetings, but productive. We'll call tomorrow evening. Give Bridget my best. As I hit send, I realized I was no longer responding as Malcolm's betrayed wife. I was responding as Henry Blackwood's daughter, setting a trap for the people who'd tried to destroy my family's legacy. The next 3 days would determine whether Malcolm and his accomplices succeeded in their theft, or whether they'd learn why my father had never lost a fight that truly mattered. By 6 a.m. the next morning, I was sitting in the hotel business center with 3 laptops open, methodically building what would become the most comprehensive financial fraud case Boston had seen in years. Elaine had provided me with forensic accounting software that allowed me to trace transaction patterns across multiple accounts and institutions. What I discovered made Malcolm's theft look like a small-scale operation compared to the broader conspiracy. Joseph Hartwell hadn't just helped my husband. He'd been running a sophisticated scheme targeting wealthy widows and grieving families across New England for at least 2 years. The pattern was always the same. Identify recently bereaved individuals with significant assets, gain their trust through family connections or professional relationships, then systematically liquidate accessible accounts while the victims were emotionally vulnerable and distracted. Joseph's position at Meridian Capital had given him access to estate planning documents and financial profiles for dozens of high-net-worth families. I found evidence of at least 12 other victims, all women who'd lost spouses within the past 3 years. The stolen amounts ranged from $200,000 to over $800,000 per victim. My case wasn't unique. It was just the largest score because of my father's prominence and the size of my inheritance. But I'd also discovered something Joseph and Malcolm didn't know I'd found: their communication records. Malcolm had been careless with his email security, using the same password for multiple accounts. Through his business email, I'd accessed months of correspondence with Joseph that documented their entire operation. The emails revealed chilling details about their planning. Joseph had been monitoring obituaries and estate probate filings, identifying potential targets based on asset size and family structure. He'd specifically targeted women like me, those who inherited substantial wealth but lacked extensive financial experience. In one email from March, just weeks after my father's death, Joseph had written, "The Blackwood situation is perfect. Recent inheritance, emotional vulnerability, husband with access to all financial information. We should be able to clear at least $500K before she understands what's happening." Malcolm's response had been equally cold. Ruby still trusts everyone completely. Her father's death devastated her. She's not paying attention to day-to-day finances. At all. We could probably take more if we're patient. The casual way they discussed destroying my life was perhaps more painful than the theft itself. These weren't desperate men making impulsive decisions. They were calculating predators who'd identified me as prey and systematically planned to consume everything they could access. But the emails also revealed critical intelligence about their escape plan. They weren't just going to Barbados for a vacation, they were planning to continue to the Cayman Islands, where Joseph had established accounts under assumed identities. From there, they intended to transfer to a non-extradition country, probably somewhere in South America where their stolen millions could fund comfortable lifestyles beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The operation was scheduled to conclude Friday morning, but not with their departure to Barbados. That was misdirection. Their real flight was Friday evening, Barbados to Grand Cayman to Buenos Aires, Argentina. By Saturday, they'd be beyond the reach of traditional legal remedies. As I printed out the most damning emails, my phone buzzed with a call from Deborah. "Sterling. Ruby, we have a problem. Joseph Hartwell just filed paperwork claiming you've given him temporary power of attorney due to mental incapacity following your father's death." The words hit me like ice water. "That's impossible. I never signed anything like that." "I know, but he's got documentation that looks legitimate. A psychological evaluation claiming you're suffering from severe depression and decision-making. Impairment. Medical records suggesting you've been under psychiatric care. Even witness statements from people who say they've observed your declining mental state. All fabricated? Obviously, but it's sophisticated enough to potentially fool a judge who doesn't know you personally. Ruby, if a court grants him even temporary authority over your affairs, he could access portions of the trust. The scope of their planning was staggering. They hadn't just been stealing what they could reach. They'd been building a legal framework to steal everything else. The psychiatric evaluation, the witness statements, the medical records, all expertly forged to support a narrative of my mental incompetence. Who are the witnesses? 3 names I don't recognize, but I'm having them investigated. There's also... Deborah paused. Ruby, Malcolm signed a statement supporting Joseph's petition. He claims he's been concerned about your mental health for months and believes you need professional financial oversight. My husband wasn't just stealing from me and abandoning me. He was actively participating in a legal scheme to have me declared mentally incompetent so his cousin could steal my father's entire legacy. When is the hearing? Friday morning, Judge Patricia Morrison, probate court. Ruby, we need to be there to contest it, but more importantly, we need evidence that this is part of a larger fraud scheme. I looked at the printouts spread across the business center desk. Emails, transaction records, account statements, travel itineraries. Evidence of a multi-million-dollar fraud operation that had targeted vulnerable families across New England. Deborah, I think I can provide that evidence, but we're going to need help. This isn't just about stopping them from stealing from me anymore. We're going to expose an entire criminal enterprise. What do you need? Contact the FBI, Financial Crimes Division. And Deborah? Call Bradley Morrison. Tell him Henry Blackwood's daughter needs the best financial crime attorney in New England, and she needs him today. The quiet, grieving widow they'd targeted was about to become their worst nightmare. At 10 a.m., I walked into the boardroom at Sterling and Associates wearing my father's confidence-like armor. Around the mahogany table sat the team I'd assembled in less than 18 hours. Deborah Sterling, estate attorney, Elaine Rodriguez, financial investigator, Special Agent Glenn, Parker from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, And Bradley Morrison, now one of Boston's most respected financial litigation attorneys. Bradley had been my first call after speaking with Deborah. When I'd explained the situation, his response had been immediate. "Ruby, I'll be there in 2 hours." "And Ruby? Your father would be proud of how you're handling this." Now, looking at the evidence spread across the conference table, I realized that my father's years of informal business education had prepared me for exactly this moment. While everyone else saw complex financial fraud, I saw patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The key to understanding their operation, I explained, pointing to the timeline I'd constructed, is recognizing that they've been running parallel strategies. Joseph identifies and researches targets, while Malcolm provides inside access and emotional manipulation. But they've made several critical mistakes. Agent Parker leaned forward. "What kind of mistakes?" "First, they've been greedy. Instead of taking modest amounts and disappearing, they've hit multiple victims in the same geographic area. That creates patterns that investigators can track." I pulled up a map showing the locations of all 12 victims I'd identified. Every victim lived within a 50-mile radius of Hartford, where Joseph worked. That's not coincidence. It's lazy operational security. Bradley nodded approvingly. "What else?" "Second, they've relied too heavily on emotional manipulation and not enough on legal protection. All of their thefts have been technically legal because they gained access through legitimate means. Joint accounts, investment authorizations, powers of attorney. But that same legal framework leaves paper trails that document their intent." I opened my laptop and showed them the email correspondence I'd discovered. "These communications prove premeditation and conspiracy. They didn't just steal, they planned to steal, coordinated their activities, and documented their criminal intent in writing." Elaine whistled softly. "Ruby, this is better than most financial crime cases I've worked. You've essentially built their entire prosecution case for them. But that's not their biggest mistake," I continued. "Their biggest mistake was underestimating what my father taught me about business warfare." The room went quiet. Agent Parker raised an eyebrow. "Business warfare?" "My father didn't build his empire by being nice. He built it by being smarter, more ruthless, and better prepared than his competitors. When someone tried to cross Henry Blackwood, he didn't just defeat them, he destroyed them so completely that they became cautionary tales for anyone else who might consider challenging him." I stood and walked to the whiteboard, sketching out a strategy that had been forming in my mind since discovering the theft. Malcolm and Joseph think they're playing chess while I'm playing checkers. They're about to discover that I learned chess from a grandmaster. "What do you have in mind?" Deborah asked. "We're going to use their own plan against them. They want me declared mentally incompetent so Joseph can access the trust? Perfect. Let them think they're succeeding. They want to disappear to a non-extradition country with their stolen millions? Even better. We're going to help them get there." Bradley looked concerned. "Ruby, that sounds incredibly risky." "It's the only way to catch them with everything they've stolen from all their victims. If we arrest them now, they'll claim the money was legitimately accessed through their various authorizations. Their lawyers will argue that grieving widows gave them permission to manage assets during emotional crises." I turned back to the group. "But if we let them execute their escape plan while we're monitoring everything, we catch them in the act of international money laundering, identity fraud, and permanent theft. Plus, we recover assets for all their victims, not just me." Agent Parker was taking detailed notes. "You want to run a sting operation using yourself as bait." "Exactly. And I want to use the one advantage they don't know I have. The trust fund isn't just money. It's a network of business relationships, legal connections, and investigative resources that my father spent 40 years building. Malcolm thinks he's stealing from a naive widow. He's actually stealing from an organization that has more power and resources than most small countries." Elaine leaned back in her chair. "Your father really did prepare you for this, didn't he?" He used to tell me that the most dangerous opponent was the one who let you think you were winning until the moment you discovered you'd already lost. Malcolm and Joseph have been so focused on my money that they never bothered to understand what else my father left me. I pulled out my phone and showed them my contact list. Governors, senators, federal judges, international banking executives, heads of major corporations. They're about to learn that stealing from Henry Blackwood's daughter means going to war with Henry Blackwood's entire legacy. The room was silent for a moment. Then Bradley smiled. The same smile I remembered from college when he was about to demolish an opponent in debate class. So what's the plan? The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. Let Malcolm and Joseph believe they were winning, while we documented every aspect of their criminal enterprise. But executing it required me to become someone I'd never been before, a master manipulator capable of deceiving the people who thought they knew me best. That evening, I returned, home for the first time since discovering the theft. Malcolm was in the kitchen, cooking dinner with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in months. The scene would have been touching if I hadn't known he was celebrating the success of his theft. "Ruby, you're back early," he said, embracing me with what felt like genuine warmth. "How did Chicago go?" "Exhausting," I replied, allowing myself to lean into him the way I always had. The hotel deal fell through. Some issue with the financing that I couldn't understand. All that legal and financial language just goes over my head. I watched his face carefully as I delivered the line we'd crafted. Malcolm's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, a flash of satisfaction that he quickly covered with sympathy. "I'm sorry, honey. I know how much you wanted that deal to work out. Sometimes I wonder if I'm really cut out for this business world," I continued, sitting heavily at the kitchen table. "My father made it look so easy, but I feel like I'm drowning in details I don't understand." Malcolm sat across from me, taking my hands in his. "You're being too hard on yourself. It's natural to feel overwhelmed after everything you've been through." "Maybe you're right. Joseph called me yesterday, actually. He suggested that maybe I should consider letting someone else handle the more complex financial decisions for a while, just until I feel more confident." The mention of his cousin's name made Malcolm's grip on my hands tighten slightly. "Joseph's very smart about these things. What did he suggest?" "Some kind of temporary arrangement where he could help manage the more complicated aspects of the trust. He said there are legal ways to delegate authority when someone is going through a difficult emotional period." I watched Malcolm's face as he processed this information. This was the moment of truth. Would he push for Joseph's involvement, knowing it was part of their scheme to steal from me? "That might not be a bad idea," he said carefully. "Just temporarily, until you feel more like yourself again." The casual way he encouraged me to hand over control of my father's legacy to his criminal cousin was breathtaking, but I maintained my vulnerable expression, nodding uncertainly. "I don't know. It feels like giving up on what my father wanted me to do." "Ruby, your father wanted you to be happy and secure. He wouldn't want you struggling with responsibilities that are making you miserable." Over dinner, Malcolm continued to subtly encourage the idea of letting Joseph handle my financial affairs. He was smooth, never pushing too hard, always framing it as concern for my well-being. If I hadn't known about their scheme, I might have been genuinely touched by his apparent care for my emotional state. "There's something else," I said as we finished eating. "I've been having trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating. Dr. Matthews thinks I might benefit from some counseling to deal with my father's death." This was another element of our plan. Agent Parker had arranged for a trusted psychiatrist to create a treatment record that would contradict Joseph's fabricated mental health evaluation. "That sounds like a good idea," Malcolm said. "You've been through so much. The only thing is, Dr. Matthews wants to do a comprehensive evaluation. She said it might take several sessions to really understand how the grief is affecting me." "Whatever you need, honey. Take all the time you need." Malcolm's eagerness for me to undergo psychological evaluation was chilling. He was actively encouraging steps that he believed would support Joseph's petition to have me declared incompetent. After dinner, I excused myself to take a bath, giving Malcolm privacy to make the phone calls I knew he needed to make. From upstairs, I could hear his voice through the thin walls, though I couldn't make out specific words. But I didn't need to. Elaine had installed monitoring equipment that would record everything. When I came downstairs, Malcolm was on the couch watching television, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. "Feeling better?" he asked. "A little." I called Joseph and told him I'd like to meet tomorrow to discuss his offer to help with the financial management. Malcolm tried to hide his excitement, but I could see it in his eyes. "That's great, Ruby. I think you're making the right decision." As we got ready for bed, I played the role of the grateful, dependent wife who was finally accepting help with burdens too complex for her to handle alone. Malcolm played the part of the caring husband, concerned only with my well-being and recovery. But lying in bed next to him, listening to his steady breathing as he slept peacefully beside me, I felt a cold satisfaction knowing that every word of our conversation had been recorded, every element of his deception documented. Tomorrow, Joseph would meet with the woman he thought was a vulnerable mark ready to hand over control of $50 million. Instead, he'd be walking into a trap that would capture not just him and Malcolm, but evidence of their entire criminal operation. They'd taught me to be a better actress than I'd ever known I could be. By the end of the week, they'd discover just how convincing my performance had been. The meeting with Joseph took place at his new office, a small suite in a Hartford business complex that he'd rented under his consulting company, Hartwell Financial Advisory. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was using stolen money to fund the very business he claimed would help manage my finances. I'd arrived 30 minutes early and sat in my car, watching as FBI surveillance vehicles took positions around the building. Agent Parker's voice came through the nearly invisible earpiece Elaine had fitted me with. "Ruby, remember, let him do most of the talking. We need him to explain his plan in his own words." Joseph greeted me with what seemed like genuine warmth, offering coffee and expressing condolences about my father that felt sincere despite knowing his true motives. He'd always been good at projecting trustworthiness. It's what had made him so effective at his crimes. "Ruby, I want you to know how much I appreciate you coming to me during this difficult time," he began, settling behind his desk with a folder of documents. "Malcolm's told me how overwhelmed you've been feeling with all the financial responsibilities." "It's been impossible," I replied, letting my voice carry the exhaustion I'd been feigning. "Every day there's another decision to make, another document to sign, another meeting with lawyers or accountants. I don't think I'm the right person for this." Joseph nodded sympathetically. "Your father was a remarkable businessman, but he may not have fully considered how difficult it would be for someone without his experience to suddenly manage such complex assets." The subtle criticism of my father was perfectly calculated, acknowledging his success while suggesting he'd been inconsiderate in expecting me to handle his legacy. It was exactly the kind of manipulation that would work on a genuinely grieving daughter. "That's why I've developed a comprehensive plan to help families in situations like yours," Joseph continued, opening his folder. "Temporary financial guardianship allows someone with expertise to manage complex assets while you focus on healing and rebuilding your life." He slid a document across the desk, the same power of attorney paperwork that Agent Parker had warned me about. But seeing it in person, I was struck by how legitimate it looked. The legal language was precise, the formatting professional. Even the signature lines were positioned exactly where they should be. "This looks very official," I said, picking up the document. "It has to be. The courts take financial guardianship very seriously, especially with estates of this size. That's why we've also arranged for a comprehensive psychological evaluation to document the emotional challenges you've been facing." "Psychological evaluation?" Joseph's expression became even more concerned. "Ruby, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but Malcolm and I have been worried about you. The depression, the confusion about financial matters, the difficulty making decisions. These are all natural responses to grief, but they're also indicators that you might benefit from professional support." He pulled out another document, the fabricated psychological report that claimed I was suffering from severe mental impairment. As I read through it, I was horrified by how convincing it was. The report detailed symptoms I'd never experienced, quoted therapy sessions I'd never attended, and recommended financial oversight I'd never requested. "Dr. Harrison is one of the most respected psychologists in Connecticut," Joseph explained. "She's worked with many families dealing with sudden wealth inheritance and the psychological challenges that come with it. But I've never met Dr. Harrison." Joseph's pause was almost imperceptible. "She based her evaluation on interviews with people close to you. Malcolm, some of your friends and business associates. It's a standard assessment method when the subject is too emotionally fragile for direct evaluation." The lie was delivered so smoothly that I almost admired his skill. He'd fabricated an entire psychological profile based on fictitious interviews, then presented it as professional medical opinion. What would this guardianship actually mean? I would handle all complex financial decisions, investments, business, operations, trust management, while you retain ownership of everything. Think of it as having a professional manager for your father's businesses while you take time to grieve and recover. As Joseph explained the terms, I realized the true scope of their operation. This wasn't just about stealing accessible money. They intended to take operational control of my father's entire business empire. The real estate holdings, the investment portfolios, the charitable foundations, everything would be under Joseph's authority. How long would this arrangement last? Until you feel ready to resume full control. Some clients find they prefer to maintain professional management indefinitely. It removes the stress of day-to-day financial decisions. The perfect crime. They would legally control everything while I retained technical ownership, meaning they could systematically loot the entire estate over time without it technically being theft. "There's just one thing I'm confused about," I said, maintaining my uncertain tone. "If you're helping me, why do I need to pay such high management fees?" Joseph's smile flickered. "The fees reflect the complexity of managing assets of this size. Industry standard for estates over $50 million is typically 2 to 3% annually. 2 to 3% of $50 million, between $1 and $1.5 million per year, paid to Joseph for managing assets he intended to steal. It was breathtakingly audacious. "I need to think about this," I said finally. "Of course. But Ruby, the court hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If we're going to move forward with the guardianship, we need to file the paperwork today." The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Sign now, or lose the opportunity for his help. It was the classic high-pressure sales tactic adapted for financial fraud. "I'll sign it," I said, reaching for the pen. As I forged my own signature on documents designed to steal my inheritance, Joseph smiled with what he believed was victory. He had no idea that every word of our conversation was being recorded, that FBI agents were photographing everyone who entered his building, that his entire criminal enterprise was about to collapse around him. Tomorrow's court hearing would be very different from what he expected. That evening, I sat in my father's study for the first time since his death, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of a life dedicated to building something meaningful. The room still smelled like his cologne and the leather-bound books he'd collected over decades. In this space where he'd made the decisions that built our family's legacy, I finally allowed myself to confront the full emotional weight of Malcolm's betrayal. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of shared dreams, intimate conversations, building what I thought was a partnership that would last our entire lives. I pulled out our wedding album, flipping through pictures of a day that had felt like the beginning of everything beautiful in my life. There was Malcolm, looking genuinely happy as he slipped the ring onto my finger. There was Bridget, smiling as she caught my bouquet, joking about being next to get married. There was Joseph, raising his glass in a toast to our future happiness. Even then, had they been planning this? Had our wedding been nothing more than the opening move in an elaborate con game? I found myself studying Malcolm's expression in photo after photo, searching for signs of deception I'd missed. The way he looked at me during our first dance, had that been genuine love, or was he already calculating how to access my father's money? When he'd whispered, "I love you," during our vows, had he meant it? Or had he been thinking about the financial opportunities my family name would provide? The worst part was remembering how proud my father had been to walk me down the aisle. Henry Blackwood, who trusted very few people with anything important, had welcomed Malcolm into our family. He'd included him in business discussions, asked his opinion on investment decisions, even mentioned him in the acknowledgments of his final annual report. "I'm glad Ruby found someone who makes her happy," my father had said in his wedding speech. "Malcolm, I'm trusting you with the most precious thing in my world. Take care of her." Malcolm had stood and shaken my father's hand solemnly, promising to always protect and cherish me. The memory made me physically ill now, knowing that he'd been planning to violate that trust from the very beginning. I opened my laptop and scrolled through the email evidence again, looking for clues about when their scheme had actually started. One exchange from November, just 2 months after our wedding, made my blood run cold. Joseph had written, "How's the access situation developing? Any progress on joint accounts?" Malcolm's response, "Slower than expected. Ruby's more independent than her father suggested. She insists on keeping her event planning business separate, and she actually reads everything before signing. We might need to be more patient than originally planned." Originally planned. They'd been discussing stealing from me before we were even married. Our entire relationship had been built on a foundation of premeditated fraud. But it was another email from 3 years ago that shattered whatever remained of my heart. Malcolm had written to Joseph, "Ruby's pregnant. This complicates our timeline, but it might actually work in our favor long term. Single mothers with substantial assets are often more dependent on financial support." I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. 3 years ago, I'd been pregnant for 6 weeks before miscarrying. The loss had devastated me, and Malcolm had seemed equally heartbroken, holding me while I cried and reassuring me that we'd try again when I was ready. But he'd seen my pregnancy, our potential child, as nothing more than a strategic advantage in his plan to steal my inheritance. The miscarriage that had broken my heart had been merely a tactical setback to him. I ran to the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left. Then I sat on the cold tile floor and sobbed for the naive woman who'd believed in love, who'd trusted completely, who'd thought she was building a life with someone who genuinely cared about her. When the tears finally stopped, I was left with something harder and colder than grief. Malcolm hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen 8 years of my life, my ability to trust, my faith in love itself. He'd turned our marriage into an elaborate performance while he systematically planned to destroy me. I called Bradley, needing to hear a voice that represented something real from my past. When he answered, I could barely speak. "Ruby? What's wrong?" "Did you ever suspect?" I asked. "When we were together in college, when you met Malcolm at the wedding, did you ever think something was off about him?" There was a long pause. "Ruby, why are you asking this now?" "Please, I need to know." Bradley sighed. "Your father asked me the same question after you got engaged. He said something felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Malcolm was charming, successful enough, seemed to genuinely care about you. But what? He was too interested in your family's money. Not in an obvious way, but he asked a lot of questions about your father's business, about inheritance, laws, about trust structures. At the time, I thought he was just trying to understand the world he was marrying into. And now? Now I think your father's instincts were right. Ruby, I'm so sorry. If I'd said something then, it wouldn't have mattered. I was in love with who I thought he was. After I hung up, I sat in my father's chair and tried to imagine what he would do in this situation. Henry Blackwood had never been a man to accept defeat or betrayal quietly. When competitors tried to undercut his business, he didn't just protect himself. He destroyed them so completely that they served as warnings to others. Malcolm and Joseph thought they were stealing from a grieving widow. They were about to discover they'd declared war on Henry Blackwood's daughter, and she'd inherited more than just his money. She'd inherited his ruthlessness. The broken, trusting woman who'd signed those papers in Joseph's office was gone forever. In her place sat someone who understood that justice wasn't just about recovering stolen money. It was about ensuring that predators who targeted vulnerable families faced consequences severe enough to deter others from following their example. Tomorrow's court hearing wouldn't just be about stopping their theft. It would be about making them pay for every tear I'd shed, every moment of trust they'd violated, every dream they'd poisoned with their greed. By Thursday morning, my father's conference room had been transformed into a war room. The mahogany table that had once hosted business meetings now displayed evidence of the most sophisticated financial fraud case Massachusetts had seen in a decade. Around it sat the team that would determine whether Malcolm and Joseph's scheme succeeded or failed spectacularly. Bradley arrived first, carrying 3 briefcases and looking every inch the Harvard-educated attorney who'd never lost a major financial crimes case. Behind him came Agent Parker, accompanied by 2 other FBI agents I hadn't met, specialists in international money laundering and cyber-financial crimes. Deborah brought her paralegal staff and a stenographer to document everything. We discussed. The stakes were too high to rely on memory or handwritten notes. Elaine arrived with a mobile forensic computer lab, 6 laptops capable of real-time financial tracking across multiple international banking systems. But the most important addition to our team was someone I hadn't expected. Dr. Patricia Harrison, the real psychologist whose identity Joseph had stolen for his fraudulent mental health evaluation. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Harrison said as she shook my hand, "I want you to know how appalled I am that someone used my name and credentials to create that fabricated report. What they've done isn't just fraud. It's a violation of medical ethics that could have destroyed your life. Can you help us prove the evaluation was fake?" "I can do better than that. I can provide expert testimony that the psychological profile they created is not only fabricated, but professionally impossible. No legitimate psychologist would diagnose severe mental impairment based on third-party interviews alone. It violates every standard of professional practice." Agent Parker opened his laptop and pulled up the surveillance footage from Joseph's office. "Ruby, your performance yesterday was flawless. Joseph's completely convinced he's won. But more importantly, he incriminated himself multiple times during your conversation." We watched the recording together, and I was struck by how different the interaction looked from an outside perspective. Joseph's manipulation tactics were obvious when you knew what to look for. The way he created urgency, pressured me to sign immediately, presented fictional documents as legitimate medical opinions. "The best part," Bradley noted, "is that he explained his entire scheme while thinking he was convincing you to cooperate. We have him on tape admitting to fabricating psychological evaluations, forging legal documents, and planning to systematically steal from your trust fund." Elaine had been tracking Malcolm and Joseph's financial activities overnight. "They've been busy since your meeting yesterday. 3 large transfers to offshore accounts, including $200,000 that I believe was stolen from another victim, a widow, in Springfield whose husband died last month. Another victim, Mrs. Eleanor Voss. Her husband died in a car accident 4 weeks ago, leaving her with substantial life insurance and retirement savings. Joseph contacted her within days of the funeral, offering financial management services during her time of grief. The casual way they targeted grieving families was sickening. Eleanor Voss was probably sitting at home right now trusting Joseph to help her navigate her husband's estate, having no idea she was being systematically robbed. Can we help her? We're going to help all of them, Agent Parker said. Ruby, your case isn't just about recovering your money anymore. You've given us evidence of a multi-million-dollar fraud operation that's been victimizing vulnerable families across New England for years. Bradley spread out a map showing the locations of confirmed victims. 12 families, all recently bereaved, all targeted within months of losing their primary breadwinners. The pattern was clear and damning. Joseph's been using obituaries and probate filings as a shopping list, Bradley explained. He identifies high-net-worth families in crisis, then uses his financial credentials to gain trust and access. Malcolm's role was to provide inside information about your family's specific situation. What about Bridget? Elaine pulled up Bridget's social media profiles on her laptop. She's been their advanced scout. Look at this. She's friends with several of the other victims on Facebook. She's been attending charity events, grief support groups, church services, anywhere she might meet wealthy widows dealing with loss. The photos showed Bridget at fundraisers, memorial services, even grief counseling meetings. She'd been hunting for victims, pretending to offer comfort while actually gathering intelligence for Joseph and Malcolm's schemes. She's not just Malcolm's mistress, I realized. She's a full partner in their operation. Which brings us to tomorrow's hearing, Bradley said. Joseph thinks he's going to court to gain control of your assets. Instead, he's walking into a federal sting operation. Agent Parker opened another file. We've coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office. The moment Joseph presents his forged documents to the judge, he'll be arrested on federal fraud charges. We'll simultaneously execute search warrants on his office, his home, and Malcolm's business. What about their escape plan? We've been monitoring their communications. They're still planning to leave for Barbados tomorrow evening, then continue to the Cayman Islands. We'll let them get to the airport, let them think they've succeeded, then arrest them at the gate. Dr. Harrison leaned forward. Ruby, I need to prepare you for what tomorrow will be like. Joseph will try to paint you as mentally unstable, unable to manage your affairs. You'll need to demonstrate complete competence and clarity when you testify. I'm ready. Bradley smiled. Ruby, your father would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. In less than a week, you've exposed a criminal enterprise, built a federal case, and organized the resources to bring justice to multiple victims. Looking around the room at the team we'd assembled, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my father's death. The confidence that came from having the right people, the right resources, and the right strategy to win a fight that truly mattered. Malcolm. And Joseph thought they were stealing from a naive widow. Tomorrow, they'd discover they'd been fighting Henry Blackwood's daughter all along. The final planning session took place at 6 a.m. Friday morning, 3 hours before the court hearing that would determine the fate of Malcolm and Joseph's criminal enterprise. We'd moved our operation to a secure conference room at the FBI's Boston field office, where we could coordinate with federal agents across multiple states simultaneously. Agent Parker spread detailed floor plans of the courthouse across the table. Joseph will arrive at 8:30 a.m. with his attorney, a man named Glenn Patterson who specializes in probate law, but has no idea he's representing a criminal conspiracy. Malcolm will be there as a supporting witness, along with Bridget, who's prepared to testify about your alleged mental instability. What they don't know, Bradley added, is that Judge Morrison has been briefed on the situation. She's aware this is part of a federal investigation and has agreed to let the hearing proceed until Joseph presents his fraudulent evidence. The timing had to be perfect. If we moved too early, Joseph could claim he was simply offering legitimate financial services. If we waited too long, he might gain temporary control of the trust before we could intervene. Elaine showed us the real-time monitoring system she'd established. We're tracking their accounts across 7 different banks in 4 countries. The moment they try to transfer any additional funds, we'll have documentary evidence of money laundering in progress. Dr. Harrison had prepared a comprehensive psychological evaluation of me, a real one that would completely contradict Joseph's fabricated report. Ruby, you've undergone the most thorough mental health assessment I've ever conducted. The results show you're not only competent to manage your affairs, but that you're functioning at an exceptionally high level despite recent grief. Joseph's fake evaluation isn't just wrong. It's the opposite of your actual psychological profile. Agent Parker's phone buzzed with updates from surveillance teams. Malcolm left the house 20 minutes ago. He's driving toward Hartford, probably to pick up Joseph before they come to Boston together. Bridget left her apartment 15 minutes ago, driving separately. Are they still planning to catch their flight tonight? According to their communications, yes. They've confirmed their reservations, arranged for a car service to take them to Logan Airport, and Malcolm has been telling colleagues he'll be out of the country for 2 weeks. Bradley pulled out a thick folder containing warrants and legal documents. The moment Joseph presents forged evidence to the court, we execute simultaneous operations. FBI agents will arrest him in the courtroom while search teams hit his office, his home, and Malcolm's business. We'll also freeze all identified accounts and issue international warrants for asset recovery. But our plan went beyond just stopping their immediate theft. We'd identified what we believed were assets belonging to all 12 victims of their fraud scheme, and we intended to recover everything. The beauty of their operation was also its weakness, Elaine explained. They used legitimate financial institutions for most of their transfers, which means there are records of everything. We can trace every stolen dollar back to its original source. Dr. Harrison had discovered something else during her investigation into the fabricated psychological report. The fake evaluation wasn't just unprofessional, it was plagiarized. Joseph copied entire sections from legitimate psychological assessments, just changing names and details. We can prove he had access to confidential medical records, which adds federal privacy violations to his charges. Agent Parker received another update. Our team in the Cayman Islands is in position. The accounts Joseph established there are under surveillance, and the local authorities are prepared to freeze everything the moment we give the signal. What about their escape route? We've confirmed their flight plan. Boston to Barbados tonight, then Barbados to Grand Cayman Sunday morning, then Grand Cayman to Buenos Aires Monday evening. They think they'll be beyond our reach by Tuesday morning. Bradley smiled grimly. What they don't realize is that Argentina has been very cooperative with financial crime investigations since their own banking crisis. Buenos Aires won't be the safe haven they're expecting. As we finalized the last details, I realized we weren't just planning to stop a theft. We were orchestrating the complete destruction of a criminal enterprise. Every asset would be recovered, every victim would be made whole, and every conspirator would face federal charges. Ruby, Agent Parker said, I need to ask you one more time. Are you absolutely certain you want to go through with testifying today? Joseph's attorney will try to make you look unstable and incompetent in front of a packed courtroom. I thought about Eleanor Voss, trusting Joseph to help her navigate her husband's estate while he stole her life savings. I thought about the 11 other families who'd been victimized by this scheme. I thought about my father, who'd taught me that with great resources came great responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Agent Parker, Joseph and Malcolm aren't just stealing money. They're preying on families at their most vulnerable moments, turning grief into opportunity for theft. Someone needs to stop them, and I'm the only one who can testify about their methods from direct experience. Bradley gathered his papers. Then let's go to court. It's time to show Joseph Hartwell what happens when you try to steal from Henry Blackwood's daughter. As we left for the courthouse, I felt my father's presence, more strongly than at any time since his death. He'd spent his life building something meaningful, and I was about to ensure that his legacy would be protected from those who'd tried to destroy it. The final phase of our operation was about to begin. The Suffolk County Courthouse was busier than usual that Friday morning, but I noticed the additional security personnel positioned strategically throughout the building. FBI agents in plain clothes, court officers who weren't part of the regular staff, and technical personnel setting up equipment that looked like standard courtroom audio systems, but were actually recording devices capable of capturing evidence with perfect clarity. I entered the probate courtroom at exactly 8:45 a.m., dressed in the conservative business suit my father had bought me for my first board meeting. Joseph was already seated at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, Glenn, Patterson looking confident and prepared. Malcolm sat in the gallery behind them, wearing his best suit and the expression of concerned husband he'd perfected over 8 years of marriage. Bridget sat 3 rows back, dressed professionally and carrying a folder that I assumed contained her fabricated testimony about my mental state. She looked genuinely nervous, which suggested she might not fully understand the legal jeopardy she was in. Judge Patricia Morrison entered promptly at 9 a.m. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with complex family financial disputes. What Joseph didn't know was that Judge Morrison had presided over several high-profile financial fraud cases and had been personally briefed by the FBI about today's operation. "This is the matter of Hartwell versus Henderson," she announced, "regarding petition for temporary financial guardianship. Mr. Patterson, you may proceed." Joseph's attorney stood and delivered an opening statement that was both professional and completely ignorant of the true situation. He spoke about the challenges of sudden wealth inheritance, the emotional impact of losing a parent, and the responsible approach of seeking professional financial management during difficult times. "Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson has been struggling with the complex responsibilities of managing a $50 million trust fund. The psychological evaluation we've submitted demonstrates that she's currently unable to make sound financial decisions due to grief-related depression and anxiety." Patterson presented Joseph's fabricated psychological report as if it were legitimate medical documentation. I watched Judge Morrison's expression remain neutral as she reviewed documents she already knew were fraudulent. "Mr. Hartwell," the judge said, addressing Joseph directly, "please explain your qualifications to serve as Mrs. Henderson's financial guardian." Joseph stood and delivered what he clearly believed was a compelling presentation of his credentials. He detailed his years at Meridian Capital, his experience managing high-net-worth portfolios, and his family relationship with Malcolm that gave him personal insight into my situation. What he didn't know was that every word was being recorded, not just for the court record, but as evidence in the federal case against him. When he claimed expertise in managing assets similar to Mrs. Henderson's inheritance, he was documenting his knowledge of my financial situation in ways that would later prove premeditation. "Your Honor," Joseph continued, "I've prepared a comprehensive management plan that would protect Mrs. Henderson's assets while allowing her to focus on healing from her recent loss." He presented the plan with charts and graphs that looked impressively professional. But I knew that Bradley and the FBI had already analyzed every detail, identifying numerous elements that were designed to facilitate theft rather than asset protection. When it was time for witness testimony, Malcolm took the stand and delivered, a performance that would have been convincing if I hadn't known about his criminal conspiracy. He spoke about his concerns for my mental health, his observations of my difficulty managing financial decisions, and his belief that professional oversight would be in my best interest. "My wife has been struggling since her father's death," Malcolm testified, looking directly at me with what appeared to be genuine concern. "She's confused by complex financial documents. She's been having trouble sleeping, and she's made several comments about feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing such substantial assets." Every word was carefully crafted to support Joseph's petition while sounding like the observations of a caring husband. If I hadn't read his emails planning my financial destruction, I might have been touched by his apparent devotion. Bridget's testimony followed the same pattern. She spoke about her friendship with me, her observations of my emotional state, and her professional opinion, as Malcolm's secretary, that I would benefit from expert financial guidance. Ruby has always been more comfortable with creative work than business management, Bridget said, her voice carrying what sounded like genuine affection. I think she's trying to honor her father's memory by managing his business empire, but it's clearly causing her significant distress. Finally, it was my turn to testify. As I walked to the witness stand, I could see Agent Parker positioned near the back of the courtroom, his hand near his radio. The moment had arrived when Joseph would either succeed in gaining control of my assets or discover that his entire scheme had been exposed. "Mrs. Henderson," Bradley began, "are you prepared to tell this court about your actual mental and emotional state and about the events that led to Mr. Hartwell's petition?" I looked directly at Joseph, seeing the confidence in his eyes as he waited for me to confirm his narrative of mental incompetence. "Yes," I said clearly. "I'm prepared to tell this court exactly what Mr. Hartwell and my husband have been planning." Joseph's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to dawning horror as he realized that the vulnerable woman he thought he was manipulating was about to destroy him. My testimony lasted 47 minutes and dismantled Joseph's entire criminal operation piece by piece. Speaking clearly and methodically, I presented evidence of systematic financial fraud that had been targeting grieving families across New England for over 2 years. "Your Honor, the psychological evaluation submitted by Mr. Hartwell is completely fabricated," I began, pulling out Dr. Harrison's legitimate assessment. "I have never met Dr. Harrison, never undergone the evaluation described in that report, and the symptoms attributed to me are fictional." I watched Joseph's face as I described discovering the theft from our joint accounts, the liquidation of our investment portfolios, and the email communications between him and Malcolm planning my financial destruction. His attorney, Glenn Patterson, looked increasingly horrified as he realized his client had used him to present fraudulent evidence to a federal court. "Furthermore," I continued, "Mr. Hartwell has been operating this scheme against multiple victims. Mrs. Eleanor Voss of Springfield, recently widowed, has had over $200,000 stolen through identical methods. Mr. and Mrs. Davidson of Worcester lost their retirement savings after Mrs. Davidson's cancer diagnosis. The pattern is consistent and intentional." Bradley stood and presented the evidence. We'd compiled bank records, email communications, forged documents, and testimony from other victims who'd been contacted by FBI agents over the past 2 days. The scope of the conspiracy became clear as each piece of evidence was entered into the record. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly stern as the testimony continued. When I finished, she called a brief recess, during which Joseph huddled frantically with his attorney while Malcolm sat pale and silent in the gallery. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Morrison said when court resumed, "do you have any response to these allegations?" Joseph stood shakily. "Your Honor, I believe Mrs. Henderson is experiencing paranoid delusions related to her grief. The financial transactions she's described were all legitimate." That was when Agent Parker stepped forward and placed Joseph under arrest. "Joseph Hartwell, you're under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy." "To commit theft," Agent Parker announced as he approached the plaintiff's table. "You have the right to remain silent." The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos as FBI agents moved in. Malcolm was arrested as he tried to slip out the back door. Bridget was detained as a material witness, her folder of fabricated testimony, now evidence in a federal case. Glenn Patterson, Joseph's attorney, immediately requested to withdraw from representation and began cooperating with federal investigators. He'd unknowingly participated in presenting fraudulent evidence to a federal court and was eager to minimize his own legal exposure. Judge Morrison formally denied Joseph's petition and ordered all his assets frozen pending investigation. More importantly, she issued emergency protective orders for all identified victims, ensuring their remaining assets would be secured while authorities worked to recover what had been stolen. As I left the courthouse, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that justice wasn't just theoretical, it was being served in real time. But the operation wasn't over yet. Malcolm and Joseph had been planning to flee the country in just 8 hours, and we still needed to recover the millions of dollars they'd already moved to offshore accounts. The next phase would determine whether their victims recovered their life savings or lost everything to a scheme that had been years in the making. But as I walked past the news crews gathering outside the courthouse, I knew my father would have been proud. Henry Blackwood's daughter had just dismantled a criminal enterprise that had preyed on vulnerable families, and she'd done it using the very network of relationships and resources he'd spent a lifetime building. The hunt for their stolen millions was about to begin. With Malcolm and Joseph in federal custody, the focus shifted to recovering the millions of dollars they'd already moved to offshore accounts. Their arrests had been deliberately timed to give us maximum advantage. They were in jail, but their money was still accessible through accounts they'd established under false identities. Agent Parker's team had been monitoring their financial communications throughout the week, and we knew they'd planned to make final transfers after their supposed departure for Barbados. Their arrest meant those transfers would never happen, leaving their stolen assets frozen in intermediate accounts, where we could reach them. Elaine worked her forensic accounting magic from the FBI field office, tracking money across 7 different countries. They moved $2.3 million total, she announced, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards. But they were sloppy about covering their digital tracks. Every transfer has documentation linking it back to the original theft. The international cooperation was swift and comprehensive. Within hours of the arrests, authorities in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Barbados had frozen accounts containing funds traced to the fraud scheme. Joseph's network of false identities, which had taken him months to establish, crumbled under scrutiny from international banking regulators. But the most satisfying element was psychological. Malcolm and Joseph had been so confident in their escape plan that they'd made no contingency preparations for getting caught. Their entire strategy had depended on being beyond the reach of American law enforcement by Saturday morning. Instead, they were in federal holding cells, while teams of agents dismantled their criminal enterprise piece by piece. The car service they hired is still waiting at Logan Airport, Agent Parker reported with obvious satisfaction. Their luggage is packed, their boarding passes were printed, and they had over $50,000 in cash for immediate expenses once they reached Argentina. They were 30 minutes away from what they thought would be permanent freedom. Dr. Harrison arrived at the field office with remarkable news about the other victims. Ruby, 11 of the 12 families targeted by this scheme want to press charges. More importantly, they want to work together to ensure these men face the maximum possible sentences. Eleanor Voss, the Springfield widow whose husband had died, just a month ago had driven to Boston specifically to thank me. When she arrived at the FBI office, I was struck by how much she reminded me of myself just a week earlier. Devastated by loss, trusting people who'd exploited her vulnerability. Mrs. Henderson, if you hadn't fought back, I would have lost everything, she said, tears in her eyes. They took my husband's life insurance, our retirement savings, even the college fund we'd set up for our grandchildren. I thought Joseph was helping me, but he was destroying my family's future. By evening, the scope of our success was clear. Every stolen dollar had been located and frozen. Every victim would recover their losses completely. Every conspirator faced federal charges that would likely result in decades in prison. Malcolm and Joseph's perfect crime had become their perfect downfall, orchestrated by the woman they'd underestimated most completely. But for me, the real victory wasn't financial. It was knowing that my father's legacy had been used to protect other families from the same predators who'd tried to destroy mine. The quiet widow they'd targeted had become their worst nightmare, and justice had never felt more satisfying. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse as Judge Andrew Sullivan sentenced the 3 conspirators who had tried to destroy my life and the lives of 11 other families. The trial had been swift and decisive. Their own emails and recorded conversations had provided prosecutors with overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Joseph Hartwell received 22 years in federal prison for orchestrating the fraud scheme. As the mastermind who'd used his financial credentials to target vulnerable families, he faced charges of wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy. The judge had been particularly harsh about his exploitation of grieving families. Mr. Hartwell, Judge Sullivan said during sentencing, "You used your professional position to prey upon people at their most vulnerable moments. You turned their grief into your opportunity, their trust into your weapon. This court finds your actions particularly reprehensible." Malcolm received 18 years for his role in the conspiracy. His betrayal of our marriage vows and his intimate knowledge of my family's finances had made his participation especially damaging. Watching him in shackles as the sentence was read, I felt no satisfaction. Only a cold recognition that the man I'd loved had never truly existed. Bridget received 8 years for her role in identifying and researching victims. Her tearful apology, in court, had felt genuine, but it couldn't undo the damage she'd helped inflict on 12 families who'd trusted her friendship. The financial recovery had been complete. Every victim had been made whole, with interest and damages paid from the frozen offshore accounts. Eleanor Voss had recovered her husband's life insurance and retirement savings. The Davidson family had gotten back the money stolen during Mrs. Davidson's cancer treatment. 11 other families had been restored to financial security. But the broader impact went beyond individual recoveries. The case had exposed systematic weaknesses in how financial institutions handled accounts for recently bereaved clients. New federal regulations now required additional oversight for financial advisors working with grieving families. Agent Parker, who'd become something of a friend through the investigation, had been promoted based on his work exposing the fraud ring. "Ruby," he told me after the sentencing, "this case has become a model for how to investigate financial crimes targeting vulnerable populations. Your willingness to fight back saved not just your family's legacy, but potentially dozens of other families who might have been victimized." Dr. Harrison had testified as an expert witness about the psychological manipulation tactics used by the conspirators. Her research on financial fraud schemes targeting grieving families had been published in several professional journals, helping other psychologists recognize and report similar situations. As I left the courthouse that day, I realized that my father's death had led not just to personal devastation, but to a kind of rebirth. The naive woman who'd trusted completely was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes protecting what matters most requires being willing to fight battles you never expected to face. Malcolm had stolen 8 years of my life and nearly destroyed my father's legacy. But in trying to break me, he'd actually revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about ensuring that predators faced consequences severe enough to deter others from following their path. 2. Years after Malcolm's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of the Henry Blackwood Foundation for Financial Justice, looking out at Boston Harbor, where my father had first brought me as a child to teach me about perseverance. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd initially envisioned, becoming a national resource for families targeted by financial predators. The organization employed 12 full-time investigators, 6 attorneys specializing in financial fraud, and a network of victim advocates who'd experienced similar betrayals. We'd helped recover over $50 million in stolen assets and had assisted in prosecuting dozens of financial predators across the country. Eleanor Voss had become our lead victim, advocate using her own experience to help other recently widowed women recognize and avoid financial manipulation. Ruby taught me that grief doesn't make us weak, she often told the families we helped. It makes us vulnerable, but it also makes us strong enough to fight for what matters. Bradley had joined our board of directors, bringing his legal expertise to cases that reminded us both why some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. Our relationship had evolved into something deeper than our college romance. A partnership built on shared values and mutual respect for what we'd both learned about justice and resilience. The most meaningful change had been personal. I'd learned to trust again, but with the wisdom that came from understanding the difference between healthy skepticism and paralyzing fear. The woman who'd been devastated by Malcolm's betrayal had become someone who could love deeply while protecting herself and others from those who would exploit that love. The trust fund my father had left me had grown to over $75 million, but, more importantly, it had become a tool for protecting vulnerable families rather than simply preserving wealth. We'd endowed scholarships for financial literacy education, funded research into elder financial abuse, and created emergency assistance programs for families dealing with sudden financial crises. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been unexpected. 3 months ago, I'd received a letter from Malcolm in federal prison. He'd written to apologize, claiming he'd found religion and wanted to make amends for the damage he'd caused. I'd thrown the letter away without reading it. Completely. Some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness, and some people forfeited the right to redemption through their choices. Malcolm had taught me that love without wisdom was dangerous, but he'd also taught me that wisdom without compassion was empty. The Foundation's work had shown me how to channel the anger and pain from his betrayal into something that protected others from experiencing the same devastation. Every family we helped, every predator we stopped, every dollar we recovered was proof that trauma could become purpose if you were strong enough to transform it. My father had left me $50 million and the tools to protect it. But Malcolm's betrayal had taught me something even more valuable, that true strength came not from avoiding vulnerability, but from surviving it and using that survival to help others do the same. Ruby will never figure out the passwords. She's always been terrible with technology. Those words had started my journey from victim to victor. Now they served as a reminder that underestimating someone's capacity for growth and resilience was often the first step toward your own downfall. The quiet accountant they'd tried to silence had found her voice, and she'd used it to speak for everyone who'd been betrayed by those they trusted most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.